The brutal politics of evacuation in Syria. Sunni extremists ambush buses meant for Shia evacuees, thus scuppering the evacuation of thousands from Aleppo, including the seriously wounded. These are the patients who thought they were being evacuated today and now have to stay put, their lives in even greater peril. Good evening. The evacuation of people from Aleppo has become a brutal game of tit-for-tat that reflects Syria's messy sectarian war. After several days of delays, a deal had finally been reached to evacuate thousands of civilians, rebel fighters and their families from one last besieged enclave of eastern Aleppo. Buses were poised, hospital patients prepared for the journey, hopes restored. But the attack by Sunni extremists means that the deal is now off and the agony grinds on. This is what our camerawoman, Waad Al-Khatib, has just told us from inside the hospital.
There's no hope at all. Now we are cleaning the hospital, preparing all the rooms to start working again, and no hope at all to leave.
Standoff at a Crusader castle in Jordan. One Canadian tourist shot dead, others believed to be held hostage inside the ancient fortress, now surrounded by armed police. And do these buildings and statues represent British values? And if so, would swearing allegiance to them make us more integrated? The government wants an oath. The devil is in the words. So it's the incident which ended the latest attempt to evacuate civilians and rebel fighters from the battle-scarred Syrian city of Aleppo. The deal that saw Syrian forces allow in buses and ambulances to the former rebel-held areas of eastern Aleppo was contingent on a similar commitment by opposition groups to allow Shia communities to be evacuated from the villages of Al-Fuwa and Kafraya and the mostly rebel-held area of Idlib. But the attacks on buses heading for those villages by ex-Nusra Front rebels has put an end to any deal. Much of the material in this report by Simon Israel was shot by Waad Al-Khatib, Channel 4's camerawoman inside eastern Aleppo, and some of it is distressing.
They said they needed 50 ambulances for 120 patients. Today they were promised only 2 under the renewed evacuation plan. Yet in every corridor, in every corner, on every inch of floor, lie the injured, the sick and the dying in this makeshift hospital basement. One asks our camerawoman, Waad Al-Khatib, for updates. He's been waiting a week and the bleeding won't stop. As the hours ticked by, still no news. No ambulances, no buses. The desperation, the urgency increases. This man wants his friend to be treated as a priority. Now they've been told only 2 ambulances will be coming.
2 cars are only enough for 4 cases, nothing more than that. The rest of the injured people are still in the only field hospital left inside the city. The rest of the injured are all over the streets, and no one is listening to our calls.
And then there are the babies, whose cries are barely heard.
She's 2 months old, just arrived here in the hospital. They were at the checkpoint for 3 hours and the weather was very cold. They couldn't cross and they came back. She has cramps now and there's no paediatrician and no basic medicines.
Their release from Aleppo has been hanging on one crucial condition: the freedom of hundreds of others in the besieged pro-Assad villages of Fuwa and Kafraya. A convoy of buses was laid on. But then a Sunni extremist faction intervened and set fire to the fleet before it could reach those villages. We won't let you evacuate the Shia, you pigs, said one attacker. They'll only come out when they are dead. Back in the rebel enclave of eastern Aleppo tonight, all hope has been crushed, and the sick and the injured have returned to their precarious existence.
Now we are cleaning the hospital, preparing all the rooms to start working again, and we will still here now. We don't know if we will leave, and no hope at all to leave.
But that is not the picture Syrian state TV is broadcasting tonight. It showed half a dozen buses with, it said, militants and their families waiting at the checkpoint to cross into the west of the city and to freedom. Yet not one person can be seen on the coaches or on the roadside. The injured and the vulnerable are supposed to be the priority in an evacuation from a war zone where civilians and fighters live alongside each other. Tonight, by any account, they were not.
Simon, Israel. Well, tonight, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations has said that his country will veto a French resolution calling for UN monitoring of evacuations from Aleppo and the protection of civilians who remained. Vitaly Churkin said there was a way of achieving the same result, but he did not elaborate. Well, we're now joined from Nottinghamshire by the former International Development Secretary, Andrew Mitchell. Thanks for coming on the programme, Andrew Mitchell. Now, you heard what the Russian ambassador at the UN there had to say. You've seen the situation on the ground in Aleppo. Even the ICRC is unable to kind of help broker a deal or ensure that if there is a deal, it actually goes ahead. I mean, this is a really sorry state of affairs for the international community, isn't it?
The position is absolutely appalling, and it is very hard to find the right words to condemn the failure of the international community to help these desperate people who are there in their tens of thousands. I wasn't able to see your report, but I've seen other reports, and they show that they are people like us. These are children who are traumatized, caught up in this desperate situation, and the international community has been completely powerless to help them. We're not on anyone's side. We want to ensure that these people are treated properly and that humanitarian law, the basic tenets of it, are adhered to by all the combatants and by the international community. And yet, you know, tonight the Aleppo looks like Stalingrad at the end of it being pulped by the Germans. There are children nowhere to go, on the rubble, hiding there in temperatures which are going to reach -3 or -4 tonight.
I hear your anger and I understand your indignation, and it's shared by many people, but as a politician in Britain, you're incapable, unable to do anything about it.
Well, I've always believed, from the time that I had responsibility in the British government for humanitarian issues, I have always believed that the international community should use its military muscle to protect these people. And it's clearly not going to happen now. But what we need to argue for, the British government, all governments in sane and decent countries need to argue for the basic rule of international law to be adhered to stop these grotesque breaches of human rights, these war crimes that are being committed. And, you know, tonight, as we approach Christmas, you know, the temperature, it's cold enough here. The temperature in Aleppo is 10 degrees below what it is here in the Midlands. And, you know, common decent humanity suggests that the Russian ambassador to the United Nations should hang his head in shame that he should say that. Everyone knows what the answer to this is to give unfettered access to the International Red Cross, to the United Nations. These are people who aren't taking a side in this fight. They just want to help people who are caught up in it. And we need them to have unfettered access to get these poor people out of Aleppo and north towards the Syrian-Turkish border and Rahanli, where there are facilities to look after them, hospitals to treat the sick people, and food and medicines to help.
But what the Russians would say is, you in London or in Washington or at the UN and have not been prepared to put your actions where your indignation has been all along. So where is your moral high ground on this? Words alone are not enough.
Well, it's true, and unfortunately, the fact is that international diplomacy reached a new low when the President of the United States, the most powerful country on earth, made it absolutely clear that if chemical weapons were used, that would cross a red line and America would take action. and they used chemical weapons. He did nothing, and that sent a signal to the combatants that the rule of law, the international humanitarian law, was being breached, and that the West, the international community, would do nothing about it. And that's why we're in this terrible situation tonight.
OK. Andrew Mitchell, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, militant gunmen in Jordan are believed to be holding tourists hostage in a Crusader-era castle after shooting dead a Canadian tourist and 4 police officers. At least 9 other people were injured in a series of attacks in the city of Karak near the border with Israel. After the attacks, the gunmen fled to the ancient castle in the town, reportedly taking hostage an unknown number of tourists inside. The castle has been surrounded by armed police. Now, would an oath of allegiance help improve community integration in Britain? It's the idea of the Community Secretary, Sajid Javid, following a report on social cohesion. He wants not just migrants, but all elected officials, civil servants and council workers to take the oath, which would pledge support for British values. But will the devil be in the detail? Asad Beg has this report.
Flanked by her son and heir in a portrait for her 90th birthday celebrations, perhaps nothing embodies Britain more than the Queen. Today, the government tried to flesh out that ambiguous concept of Britishness by proposing that public office holders and new arrivals swear an oath. Any oath of allegiance won't be to Queen and country, but what it will be to is British values, a term that itself provokes debate. So this raises a question: what exactly is meant by British values?
British values. I suppose it's the values that people who live in Britain hold themselves to.
Which are?
Which are honesty, integrity, truth.
I don't really know if I can give you an answer to that. It's too difficult a question to think about.
What's different between like an American value and a British value?
Yeah.
Would you say
English tea?
Yeah, the Queen and like, you know, like British tea, like that. You know, like just everything that involves Britain.
I was asked what British values were, and I think it's a difficult question. What do you think British values are?
Respect,
Respect, that's a good thing. What else? Fairness?
friendship,
Friendship, that's good.
fairness.
Fairness, another good thing.
The vexed issue of integration and community cohesion led to an independent report produced earlier this month. Among a number of recommendations, its author, Dame Louise Casey, suggested an integration oath to British values. Today, the Community Secretary backed that proposal and set out his definition.
I'm talking about tolerating the views of others, even if you disagree with them. About believing in freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from abuse. I'm talking about a belief in equality, democracy and the democratic process. And about respect for the law, even if you think the law is an ass.
I think the important thing is that we know about values of democracy and equality, and I think that's quite a good idea. But the idea that you should take an oath to something that we haven't actually had a discussion about and defined is a slightly odd concept.
But his cabinet colleague, Dr. Liam Fox, wouldn't be drawn on what such an oath may include.
I think it's a very interesting idea which we'll explore over time. I'm sure we'll want to think of different things.
What are the values you think should be used?
Tolerance.
In a nation that seems to be struggling with its identity, the new proposals have certainly reignited the debate around what it means to be British. Like British values, there will be much discussion around whether an oath of allegiance is necessary.
Well, I'm joined now by Dili Hussain from the Muslim news website 5 Pillars, and Philip Bond, who's the director of the independent think tank Res Publica. Thanks for coming in, both of you. Philip, let me start with you. I don't know if you heard in that report some confusion about what British values are. Tolerance, friendship, a cup of tea. What are they?
I don't think any of the answers were necessarily wrong, but let's be very clear. Unless we all, in some sense, share a common value set, we're in terrible danger. After all, it was George Orwell who pointed out that one of the reasons Britain didn't fall into communism or fascism is essentially we shared common decency. Now, common decency is something we all, I think, should regard as precious and need to repeat and recreate at every point in our history. So British values at a time of incredible polarisation, when we're polarising on education, class, race, place, where we're beginning to track American politics and the divisive kind of nature of what's happened there, they're incredibly important. And I think the Secretary of State is right to actually help foreground the debate by arguing that the state should stand up for those values.
Right.
And I think that will provoke the debate that I think is sorely needed.
But if we can only boil it down to common decency or tolerance or friendship, I mean, you kind of think that's stating the obvious. I mean, we would have hoped that that is something that is taught by families, in schools. We're embedded in that sort of culture.
Well, I think, Sajid Javid actually gave a very good list of what those values would be, and I don't think that was stating the obvious. I think freedom of speech, freedom of religion. These are things actually under threat today in many ways, because it's precisely because we haven't had the debate about British values that you get different accounts that actually start to drive wedges between people. And it's very important in a country that's always been civic, that's always been on the front line fighting against racism, that we uphold these values in the face of what confronts us.
Dilli Hussain, would you be prepared to utter an oath of allegiance that talks about decency and tolerance?
Well, no, because...
You wouldn't be?
No, I wouldn't be, because ultimately British...
Is that because you don't believe in decency and tolerance?
No, exactly. I absolutely believe in those things, but I don't think I need to subscribe to an arbitrary set of values to show my humanity or decency or even loyalty to this country. When you think of loyalty, it actually reminds me of the kind of unfortunate McCarthy era of America, which was all about curtailing free speech. And it's interesting that the respected guest mentioned George Orwell. It's exactly these kind of oaths and allegiances which essentially creates a kind of police state.
But I mean, in America, the oath of allegiance is something that is uttered every morning in every state school.
And it's optional.
But it is optional, but no one is upset about it. I mean, most people, frankly, wherever they're from, go along with it. And it's because it defends the document that defends everyone's individual values.
As you saw from that video, British values means different things to different people.
What do they mean to you?
What do they mean to me? As a British citizen living in this country, I want to be good to my neighbours. I want to contribute positively to this society. I want to abide by the laws of this land, as long as it doesn't contravene my faith. And obviously, generally be good and nice to people, and obviously contribute as much as I can positively. But that said...
Does that satisfy you, what Dilli just said?
Well, it seems contradictory. We know from Louise Casey's report that we've had a culture of multiculturalism that has tended to divide people in the name of uniting them. We know that we've had separate development where we've essentially sponsored values that are hostile to what we all hold in common. So I think it's right for us to articulate and state what British values are. And actually, we probably already would be in broad agreement. But they're quite unique, they're quite precious. And if you chart world value systems, they're not necessary, they don't come with being born, they're actually practiced. And I think what the Secretary of State is saying is actually we need the state to actually re-articulate those values, precisely because the aim of this is integration. If people come to us from abroad, we want them to know our value system so they can integrate.
So is that what this is about? This is about profiling a particular group of...
No, it's profiling all of us. And actually, if you can't define values, you can't defend them. And this is part of defining British values.
The thing is, we can't dress up, again, these arbitrary set of values because no one had a contribution in defining them. And
they're
basically,
not arbitrary, though.
They are arbitrary because they're being used.
No, because they're
certainly not organic. They're certainly not organic.
Of course they're organic.
No, so how would you deal with extremist members of any community, including your community, who say, well, actually, we don't believe in democracy, we don't believe in tolerance, we believe in our way of life and no one else's? How would you deal with that?
Well, we have to obviously question with regards to, first, let's define extremism. And within the PREVENT strategy, British values is stipulated.
Well, how about the absence of tolerance?
The absence of tolerance. Well, look, if you believe in something, I can respect for you to actually believe that. I don't necessarily have to agree with you. As long as these so-called extremists, in whichever community they may lay in, as long as they don't come out and actually take the law into their own hands. But the important point here is that we can't use this set of values and dress it out and sugarcoat it as integration. It appears to be forced assimilation to me.
OK. Big discussion for another day. Thank you very much for coming in, Dilli Hussain, Philip Blunt. Now, Hull Prison is reported to be on the brink of a riot and inmates are under lockdown after 15 prisoners transferred from Birmingham jail were involved in disturbances on arrival. Prison Officers Association said an officer had been assaulted and CCTV cameras set alight. Some existing inmates had refused to return to their cells when the trouble broke out. More than 40 illegal migrants have been rushed to hospitals in Croatia after being found crowded into the back of a van driven along a motorway. Police pulled the van over when they saw smoke coming from it. 62 people believed to be from Afghanistan and Pakistan were found inside, most of whom were found to be suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning and hypothermia and had nothing to eat or drink for several days. 3 children were among those treated in hospital. Sport, and Southampton were the victors in the Premier League clash with neighbours Bournemouth. An equaliser from Ryan Bertrand was followed by 2 goals from Jay Rodriguez, the second-day stunner, completing a 3-1 win. The win moves Southampton to 7th, Bournemouth to slip to 10th. Both sides now go into a busy festive schedule. Manchester City and Arsenal are battling for second place in the Premier League this afternoon. Arsenal took the lead early in the first half at the Etihad Stadium. Early in the second half, the score is now Manchester City 1, Arsenal 1. Our main news, the latest plan to evacuate civilians and fighters from eastern Aleppo has been halted. A militant rebel group attacked and set fire to buses assigned to evacuate pro-government families from a rebel-held area in nearby Idlib province. We're back tomorrow at 7. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Good evening. Thanks for watching.